Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we will cover important Linux security topic. How to set up a grub password. Many Linux administrators configure a grub password, but later notice that the system does not ask for a password during normal boot. This usually happens because the internal grub file flow is not clearly understood. By the end of this video, we will clearly understood which grub files are involved, how this file works together, and how grub password enforcement actually work at boot time. Now, let's start to see the agenda of the grub. In this agenda, we will see that what is the bootloader, what is grub, what is the default configuration file of the grub. Then we will see grub configuration file flow, how to set up grub password into the configuration file. After that, we will verify and find out those common mistakes when we set up the grub password. Let's see the overview of the bootloaders. Before understanding the grub, let's talk about the bootloaders. In Linux history, two main bootloaders were used, which that two bootloaders in Linux system we use Lilo and grub.2. Lilo is a legacy bootloader and grub.2 is a modern bootloader. In this video, those people who are into the new in Linux administrator, that people doesn't know the Lilo bootloader. They only aware about the grub.2 bootloader because Lilo is a legacy bootloader which is used in very older Linux operating system, that is RHEL 3, 4 and 5. Many of people doesn't know the RHEL 3, 4, 5 operating system. Why? Because that people work from the RHEL 7 to till RHEL version. That's why the people doesn't know the Lilo bootloader. Lilo store configuration directly into the MBR. There is no interactive shell and very hard to recover, and these Lilo bootloader is now obsolete and no longer used in today's date. Now talk about the grub.2 modern bootloader. It is used from RHEL 6, 7, 8, 9 and the newer operating system. It supports both MBR and GPT file system and also support modern file system like XFS and ext4. Also provide the interactive command line and support password protection and recovery. The important note is that file system and partition tables are interdependent concepts. Grub work with both file system and partition tables. How The grub works with partition table and file system. The partition table tells the grub where the slash boot partition is present, but file system tells the grub how to read that file inside that partition table. With the help of this kind, that file system and partition table are interdependent, and the grub work with that both file system and partition table. So these are the interdependent concept which is grub follow. Now we talk about the grub. Generally grub called Grand Unified Bootloader. It is the first program that runs when a Linux system starts. What is the grub? Grub stand for Grand Unified Bootloader, and when you start the Linux system, in that Linux system, the grub is the first program to start the Linux system. Now, grub is responsible for those files. Which is that file? Grub is responsible when the Linux system start. Grub loading the Linux kernel, passing the kernel parameters, and providing recovery options when Linux system start, and enforcing the boot time security. These are the responsibility grub takens when Linux system started. Now what happened when we not set up the grub password? Without a grub password, anyone with physical access can edit kernel parameters and gain the root access to doing any changes into the Linux system. These are the more important things as per the Linux security point of view. When you not set up the grub password, anyone can take the physical access of your Linux machine and edit the kernel parameters to take the root access. That's why grub password protection is a critical security control into the Linux system. Now we talk about the grub configuration file flow. Grub does not directly read /etc default grub file during a boot time. So which file grub read into the boot time? Let's see. This is the main important question and main configuration file to set up the grub password. As per the interview point of view, if anyone asks you which is the main important file when system start, the answer is our main important file is /boot grub to grub.cfg. This is the main important file Linux system read at a boot time. But what are the importance of /etc default grub file? Here we can see it is a user editable files. You can change settings but not the final files. Means if you are doing any changes into the /etc default grub file, This is the user editable file, and that changes reflect into for that particular file, not reflect into the boot grub2 and grub.cfg file. That is our main important grub configuration file. What option present into the /etc default grub file? What we change in that file? So in that file we can change boot time, default OS and kernel parameters we have to change if we need it. There is another one directory present in /etc grub.d. Inside that there are lots of files are present. What is those file? Those files are small script that creates a menu entry and that run in a order way, that is 10 underscore Linux 20 30 etc. So that file just telling grub what you want, not how to boot yet. Now we talk about how to generate the grub configuration file. After doing the changes, we have to update the grub.cfg file to reflect that changes. With the help of grub2 hyphen mkconfig space hyphen o and your grub.cfg path. When you hit the enter, that time your grub.cfg password is regenerated and whatever changes you are doing, that changes will be reflected into the grub.cfg file. Once you hit the enter, it is a script processing, that is automatic step. grub.to-mkconfig does this internally, read /etc default grub file and executed all script present into the /etc grub.d directly in a order way. That everything is combined automatically. This is like compiling the grub configuration. Once you do the changes to set the password, we have to update the grub.cfg file, and once we update that file, that changes automatically reflected and we get the final output. A full file is created /boot grub.cfg. But the one more important thing is that you do not edit this file manually, because when you edit this file manually, it will be overwritten into the next boot time. Means whatever changes you have to put in that file, that will be erased. Means that is overwritten. That changes not reflected into the next boot time. What will happen into the boot time? When the system start, BIOS or UEFI BIOS load the grub read grub.cfg file, and grub shows the menu to select the OS boot. That things happen when you boot the Linux system. But The main important work of the grub is grub only read the grub.cfg file at a boot time. Now we talk about how to set up a grub password. Grub never store plain text password into the grub file. It is use the hashing algorithm. The name is that PBKDF2. That is the hashing algorithm grub follow to generate the password. grub2-mk password hyphen pbkdf2. This is the command. With the help of this command, we generate the hashing password. After that, the password hash is stored into the user.cfg file, which is present into the slash boot grub2 user.cfg file. After set the password into the user.cfg file, we have to set the permission to that user.cfg file. That is chmod 600 slash boot grub2 user.cfg file. Why read write permission is required to user.cfg file? That file store the grub password. Even though it is a hash, it is still sensitive and security data. It prevents unauthorized reading, accidental modification, and security policy violation. For that reason, we have to set the read write permission into the user.cfg file. Now, why that user.cfg file is more important when we set up the grub password? Because user.cfg file is a source file. What's that? User.cfg is a source file. It is dynamically read by the grub at the boot time. Means when you forget to create the user.cfg file, that time you cannot set up the grub password into the boot time. Means this is the very and sensitive file to generate the grub password. Once you paste your password into the user.cfg file, you have to update your grub configuration file with the help of grub2-mkconfig-o slash boot grub2 grub.cfg. With the help of this command, we update the file to reflect the changes. Once grub.cfg generated, then grub.cfg checks user.cfg file is exist and the password is defined inside the user.cfg file. Then we have to reboot and verify our grub password is set up perfectly or not. When we reboot our system, then we have to press E or 3 option to get the password prompt. In normal behavior of the Linux system, when you press the E or C button, that time it won't ask the password. But when you set up the grub password and press the E or C button, that time it asks the username and password. Once the system asks to enter the grub menu username and password, that time we have successfully configured the grub password. But people are doing the common mistake when they setting up the grub password. Which are those common mistakes people are doing? Let's understand. They're doing the first mistake. They directly editing the grub.cfg file manually and think about it. Okay, they set the grub password perfectly, but it is wrong method. We can discuss about this, the grub.cfg file, which is not manually editable. Why? Because when you edit the grub.cfg file manually, so the next reboot, that changes will be overcommitted, or that changes will be not reflected when your system will be rebooted. Means whatever changes you are doing manually into the grub.cfg file, that changes will be lost. Second common mistake is forgetting to regenerate grub.cfg file. Means people doing all these setups to set the password and they forget to regenerate the grub.cfg file. But this is the main important things when you set up all the settings to set up the grub password and forget to regenerate or forget to update the grub.cfg file. So that time also you won't be set up the grub password. Means you are failed to set up the grub password into the next reboot. And people are expecting password during the normal boot. Means when they doing all the configuration and reboot the system without giving any output, they simply assume that key into the normal reboot the system gives you the username and password, but that is the wrong method. And one more thing about the common mistake, confusing Linux root and grub root. So these are the common mistake people doing when they set up the grub password. Now we discuss about the grub.cfg file. Grub.cfg file is at a boot time grub read only one file, that is boot grub2 grub.cfg file, and all other files exist only to generate the other files. Once you understand this flow, grub password behavior become very clear. Now let's do the hands-on practical lab how to set up the grub password. Now I am taking the duplicate access of my server, type username and my password. Now, first we see the default grub file. ls-lrts slash etc default and grub. See, yeah, this file is present. Now we have to see the content inside of that file. See, we can see that the timeout, the distributor, grub default, then terminal output, command line, and other configuration. So these are the basic configuration that default grub file stored. Now to set up the grub password, we have to generate the hash password. How do we generate that password? We use grub2 hyphen mkpass hyphen pbkdf2. With the help of this command, we can generate the grub password. I am entering the password. See, when you type the right password, you will see the password will be generated with hashing algorithm. So you can put this password into your notepad, and after that we have to put that password into the user.cfg file. Where that file will be present? That file present slash boot grub2 and user.cfg. This is the file. But before entering the password, we check that that file is already present or not. With the help of ls-lrth command, we will see that the file is already present or not. Here we see that no such file or directory is present inside the grub.to directory. Now we have to generate or we have to create that file and paste that password inside the user.cfg file. After save the password, we have to update our grub.cfg file with the help of grub2 mkconfig command -o slash boot grub2 grub.cfg. With the help of this command, we will update our grub.cfg file to reflect for the changes. Then we will check that slash boot grub2 user.cfg file. Yes, that password it's stored inside the user.cfg file. And after that, we will reboot that system to check that our password is configured successfully or not. We will hit the reboot option. This is the reboot. I am doing the reboot of my Linux system, and after that I will check my grub password is properly configured or not. See, here I am doing some mistake. When I press the C or E button into the keyboard, so it directly show me the grub console. Means my password is not properly set up. Why it is not set up properly? Let's see. I am doing accept and hit enter to reboot the machine. Doing accept button and reboot the system. Once it's reboot, then I am logging to the putty shell. Yeah, my system is successfully logged in. Now I am taking the login from my console. See. Now we are doing troubleshooting. What mistake we are doing when set up the grub password? First, we check what modules are called behind when we set up the grub password. We are doing slash boot grub2 grub.cfg pipe grape -i pass hyphen capital B3 hyphen capital A3. C. B means B means descending order and A means ascending order. With the help of this, we can find out the little script which is useful to set up the grub password. Here are the script. If my user.cfg file is present, then this is my source file, the user.cfg, which is we have stored the hash algorithm password inside that file. ls -lrth slash boot grub2 user.cfg. See, this is our source file where the grub call this file to take the password when we enter into the grub menu. Now, if grub-2 password is present, this is the variable. Then set up the super user root and export the super user password hyphen pbkdf2 root and grub2 underscore password. So this script tell us when user.cfg file is present, you can use that file as a source and set the variables grub underscore password. When you find that variable grub underscore password, then you can set the super user as a root, then export that super user, where you can export that super user you can export that super user as a root into the grub underscore password variables. Now we can see my variable is properly set or not. This is grub2 underscore password. See, we stored the password into the user.cfg file, but that password not read from the script when the machine is rebooted. We have to set up the variable. See, this kind of variable we have to set up to read that password into the boot time. Now we have to set up that variable and save the configuration file and try to reboot and check that option is coming or not. My system is asking the password or not when entering the grub menu. Yes. When we hit the C button into the keyboard, now it asks me the username. My username is root and my password is, which is I said C. We have successfully configured the grub password into the Linux system, and also we have do this some troubleshooting why our password is not set when we configure the password inside the user.cfg file, because when we set up the user.cfg file and we put the password, we forget to give the variable name inside that file. Because of this variable name, that script not read the grub underscore password variable, and that file failed to read that password. Because of this, my system doesn't read my grub password and we failed to set up the grub password. But after doing the troubleshooting and set up the variable as per the script which is called behind the grub, and when we set up the variable properly and reboot the machine, that time it asked me the username and password to entering the grub menu. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. If this video helps to clearly understand how to set up the grub password, don't forget to like, subscribe and share with your friends. See you in the next video. Bye bye.